Okay, welcome back, everyone. I need to remind you again that if you want to ask questions, please do that on the Slido DFT1. If you want to submit your lightning talk, do that at the Slido as well at DFLT. And our next speaker came all the way from Canada. And please welcome Simon MacDonald from Adobe.
All right, thank you everyone. I just really want to take this opportunity to thank the organizers of this conference for having me here. I really do appreciate it. If you haven't thanked the organizers yet, I would encourage you to do that at some point in time over the next day and a half. I've organized conferences before, I organized meetups. It's a lot of work and you don't get a lot of thank yous. So please give a round of applause for one of the organizers right here. All right, I know we're using this for questions, but another thing that we can use it for is I have this nice full glass of water right here next to my phone and my computer and all this recording equipment. So if somebody asks a question and thumbs up for they think I'm not going to spill it, thumbs down if you think I am going to spill it. Just a little voting thing, little side thing. Anyway. As you can probably tell already, I am a fairly laid-back speaker, so if you feel like interrupting me, that's perfectly okay. If you want to ask a question, just like go right ahead. So this is from a presentation I did a few months ago, and since then I've started using this kind of infinite Simon kind of way of going about things, where every time I do a talk, I try to use the slide from the previous talk. No, don't take a picture yet. We're not at the infinite one. And so right about this point, I think we're about 6 or 7 Simons deep into it. I don't know if you heard the old joke, it's turtles all the way down. So I'm hoping at some point in time it'll be Simons all the way down. So anyway, if you need to get a hold of me after the conference, probably the best way to do it is via Twitter. So my Twitter handle is MacDonst, which stands for MacDonald Simon Thomas. That was my old Unix user ID, and it's available absolutely everywhere. So that makes it a really easy pick for me. So if you see that on any social network, that's probably me. Other than that, you can just use my name at gmail.com to send me an email if you don't remember the Twitter handle. But again, that's probably the best way to get a hold of me. All right, so let's get into what we're actually supposed to be talking about today instead of everything about me, because believe me, I could talk about me for a really long time. I am a narcissist, it's great. But what we really want to talk about is cross-platform progressive web apps. And in order to do that, we have to figure out what a progressive web app is in general. So we have this nice definition here. They use modern web capabilities to deliver an app-like user experience. That's OK. That's cool. That's pretty easy to understand. But oh, man, no, I forgot I had a clicker and everything. Yeah, that did not work at all, did it? Yep. Don't ever try to use new stuff. Ah. OK, it's back. All right, so this recording may be in 2 parts later. Sorry about that. I know the video editor is going to hate me for that. All right, so we're saying we're delivering a modern app-like user experience. And basically, everything's evolving from web pages, things that are in browser tabs. So we want them to be immersive and take advantage of the web's low friction. And it's like, OK, again, a little marketing speak, but it kind of makes sense. But that leads me to the question. It's, so are they just web pages? Yeah. They're just web pages. That's all progressive web apps are. So the main takeaway I want you to have from this talk is when you go back to your jobs, progressive web apps are just a really fancy marketing term right now. Now, there is some things about them that you can take advantage of, but basically, they're just web pages. There's no reason for you not to kind of add progressive web functionality to your existing web apps or web pages. You can go ahead and do that now. So in that case, why do we actually care about progressive web apps? Like, what is it that makes them different from regular web pages and web applications? And we'll get into a bit of that. So first and foremost, the first word in progressive web apps is it is progressive. So it really shouldn't matter what browser you're in. It doesn't matter if it's Firefox, Chrome, Safari, whatever. Again, if your favorite web browser isn't up there, it's not because I hate you personally. It's just because I get lazy after about 5 icons and I can't be bothered to find Samsung's internet browser. But it shouldn't really matter what browser you're in and what functionality they support. Your application, your website should work in any of these browsers. they have to be responsive. So it wouldn't matter if you're using this from your tablet or from your phone or from a desktop. Your UI should be usable on any of these platforms. And if you're doing a really good job, you're kind of separating your UI from your backend functionality so you can take advantage of some of the new user interfaces that are coming down the pipe. I mean, I think there's talk sometime today on augmented reality and virtual reality. One of the things that I'm very interested in is speech recognition. You probably can't tell right now, but this is not my native language. I grew up on the far east coast of Canada, where it kind of sounds like you take a Scotsman and a pirate and you just jam them together. So I had to relearn English all over again when I moved to Ottawa in order for work. So you should be able to take advantage of any kind of form factor. If you're not doing responsive web design right now and you're interested in the topic, there's an absolutely fantastic short book by a guy named Ethan Marcotte. It's called Responsive Web Design, and it's on a book apart. So one of the things that I should let you know right now is at the end of this talk, there is a section that has resources of little things that I talk about, and a link to that book is in there as well. So they need to be connectivity independent. It shouldn't matter if you are on a LTE connection or a 3G or 2G connection, or you just don't have any connection at all because you're in the subway and you don't have any Wi-Fi or any LTE connection that way. So if you build your progressive web app properly, it won't matter. You can take advantage of the different network connections in order to provide offline caching so that if you already have some resources on the device so that people can use your application, or you can do some things where if the person wants to, say, like buy a t-shirt, you can go through the entire checkout process, except for the very end where you're actually sending it back to the server, but you can cache that offline to be sent once the user gets back online. So the connectivity independent functionality of progressive web apps is, to me, one of the biggest things about them, and it's very interesting to be able to implement with service workers, which there was a talk on earlier today, but we'll dive into a little bit today. Probably not in as much detail, but we will talk about them. And what you want to do with your progressive web app is you want to make it app-like. And in this case, I've just kind of used a framework that allows me to build a material website pretty quickly. And what you want to do is to separate the shell of your application, like the title bars, the menus, the left panels, all those things, from the actual content of your application. So what that will allow you to do is with your service worker is to cache all of the app-like stuff that doesn't change very frequently, but get fresh content every time you go into the application. And for instance, right here, like I said, I'm Canadian. I had to fit hockey in there somewhere, so there is a pair of hockey skates in my content. And the other nice thing with service workers is you can also cache the content so that the next time the user comes into your application, you can load the old content while you're waiting for a network request to come back with the freshest content. So that way, the time until your user starts up the application till they actually get to do something meaningful with it is very short. And that's a very key point in order to keep people engaged in your applications. And again, I said I'm Canadian and I do love hockey. And I don't know, do you guys know about these guys? They're called the Traveling Jaggers. They're amazing. So they're currently looking for their 11th or 12th member because Jagger has just signed with the Calgary Flames. And so these guys go to all of Jagger's games in his former jerseys. And he's kind of like a god in Canada. I understand he's still pretty big in the Czech Republic as well. So I'm not pandering. I just really love hockey, and I like to work it into every talk I can. All right. Your progressive web apps, they should be safe. So I'm going to ask for a show of hands. Some people will probably be too embarrassed to admit this, but who here is still serving a website over HTTP? Yeah, nobody wants to admit that. This is the section of my talk which I like to call HTTP shaming. Don't do that anymore. It's a really bad idea. You're not keeping your users safe. Now, there's things like man-in-the-middle attacks that if you're over HTTP, somebody can like interject stuff in the middle and get access to some of your users' data. That's not great. But the thing that will matter for you, for your bosses, is that Google is currently downranking any website that isn't served over HTTPS. So if you want your website to be found in Google, it makes it a lot of sense for it to be served over HTTPS. So if you're not doing that now, you should really start doing it. And there's no reason for you not to, because there's this website called let'sencrypt.org, which will make the creation of the certificates for HTTPS very easy for you. As well, if you're a web developer and you're taking advantage of some of the newer APIs that are coming out, if you're not serving over HTTPS, it just won't work. For instance, service workers, HTTPS only. Geolocation was moved to HTTPS only. The new web sharing API, HTTPS only. It goes on and on and on from there. So if you want to take advantage of some of the newer functionality in the web, you need to be on HTTPS as well. And then we get into Re-engagable. So it's great to be able to send push notifications to your application. Now, that's wonderful for you, for your bosses, for marketing people who want to be able to push out these content updates. It really kind of sucks for users. Trust me, I know this. I have worked a lot in push notifications. I have written my own push notification service. I've seen the uptake be very good and very bad depending upon how people use push notifications in their application. Now, I could talk for 40 minutes about this topic just in itself. We're not going to dive too much into it, but it will just want to let you know that using a progressive web app, you can use web push notifications. And right now, it's supported really well on Chrome and Firefox. On iOS, they use an older specification, so web push is possible. But what you really want to be able to do in order to send one message to all of those platforms is use another service on top of it that kind of aggregates that for you. There was a talk at O'Reilly's Fluent conference this year by Olga Petrova, and she goes very deep into web push notifications and the differences on iOS. Again, that's another link at the end of this talk, but we're not going to go too deep into that one. All right, so your progressive web app should be installable. So when people find your web app useful, they should be able to install it onto their home screen so they can get to it more quickly. So in this case, what we have is just a little demo that I worked up. And what's going to happen is after a couple of times of the user going into this application, they'll get this prompt here that says, hey, do you want to add this to your home screen? So in order for you to get this prompt, you have to be running on Chrome. Firefox allows you to do add to home screen, but they don't have this installation prompt yet. Chrome will allow you to do this, but it requires a couple of things. One, you're served over HTTPS. Two, you have a service worker. And three, there's an icon available for the install banner in order to use. So once you do that, at your home screen of your phone, you'll be able to get access to the website immediately. And the nice thing about this is you'll be able to cache assets so that when the person clicks on that icon in order to start your app, it'll start a lot quicker than them going to the website itself. And what you can see here is after I've started the application from the desktop, you may notice that the address bar is completely gone. So one of the things that you can do in your web app manifest file is specify whether or not you want to see that kind of browser Chrome in your application. And we'll dive into that in just a bit. So they have to be linkable. And what you want to be able to do is to get your application out to as many people as possible. And one of the best ways to do that is to reduce the amount of friction it takes in order for somebody to start using your application. So web apps, websites are available at the end of a URL. You don't have to dive into the App Store. You don't have to do any installation. You don't have to accept permissions. You don't have to download it. You don't have to do all these crazy things that kind of turn people away from native applications. So being able to make it linkable, it makes your users kind of marketers for your own application. And finally, they need to be discoverable. And that's capable via this thing called the W3C manifest. So basically, it's a new specification that allows you to put a small JSON file into your website, and it identifies it as a web application. So this is very important because web crawlers like Google and Bing will be able to find these applications and identify them as such. And there's been signals from both Google and Microsoft lately that things that are web applications will get higher, be bumped up higher in the search results on both of those search engines. So it's kind of an important part to add in there. So really, when it comes to a progressive web app, it kind of all starts with that manifest file. And in order for you to add one to your website or web application, all you need to do is in your main HTML page is add a link tag to the manifest.json. It's pretty simple. So one of the things, there was a really good article by Jason Grigsby from Cloud4, and he talks about the path that Cloud4 took to adding progressive web app functionality to their website. Now, the nice thing is, you don't have to do it all at once. You don't have to put the manifest in, you don't have to do the service worker, you don't have to add push notifications all at the same time. You can, again, progressively enhance your website with this kind of functionality. And the first step would be adding this manifest. So let's dive in and take a look at what the manifest is like. So that's it. It's a pretty short file. It's just JSON. It's easily human readable. But let's take a look at what these various things mean. First and foremost, the short name. That's the text that you're going to see underneath the icon when a user does add to home screen. Pretty simple. The name itself, it's used in a number of places. Right now, what you can see is the name is used in the installation add to home screen banner. But it could also be used when a search engine is popping up whether or not you want to install this application. You can give the full name at that point in time. And then we get into the start URL. So it's great when somebody comes in from the web because they can come into any part of your website altogether. But when somebody does add to home screen, the engine that runs the progressive web app from your phone or tablet needs to know what page to start with. And this is where you can go ahead and tell it, hey, I want you to start with index.html in this case. So one of the other things, and this isn't my trick, but it was, I think it was Dean Hume who came up with this, you may want to be able to track whether people are coming into your website via the internet or if they're actually using the new add to home screen functionality, and you want to track how many people are actually using it from the home screen. So instead of just using the same URL that you have on the web, you can add this little parameter. In this case, it's start equals A2HS for add to home screen. So if you're running your analytics package, you can see that the different sites that are getting to this URL, they either just end with index.html or they have a certain parameter. So that allows you to differentiate whether the person's coming in from the internet or from add to home screen functionality. So this is how you can actually justify to your bosses the investment that you made in progressive web apps, because you can actually tell them that people are using it. It's kind of a key point to be able to let the decision makers know that. So we have the display type, and the display type can be 4 different values. First and foremost is standalone, and standalone is when you don't have the URL bar at all. You still have the status bar, but the URL bar is completely gone. You can have full, which is basically there is no status bar, there's no URL bar, there's nothing around there. That's particularly good if you want to be developing games, because you want to take advantage of the entire screen real estate. There's a minimal UI, which gives you kind of back and forward buttons, but that's about it. And then there's browser, and obviously the browser looks exactly like the browser. So this is how you can kind of control what the UI looks like when you start from the home screen. And again, so right here is if you were coming in over the web and you're using, like, say, browser, and then if you started from the home screen with a standalone display type, then the URL bar goes away and it will look more like that. And then we have this thing called background color. Sorry about that. When you start your application from the home screen, one of the things that Chrome will do for you is create a splash screen. So it's going to do that by taking the name from the manifest, it'll take an icon from the manifest, and it'll look at the background color. So what we're doing here is we're just setting the background color to white because the main color of my application itself is white. So as the splash screen goes away and then the application is shown that's underneath it, we don't want there to be a lot of kind of like color clashing going between it. If you're used to web browsers, they usually start with like an all white or an all gray background, and then it loads the HTML or CSS, and all of a sudden you've got this like pop of color that you weren't expecting. So this allows you to kind of gradually move the user into what the main UI of the application will look like. And then, of course, we have the theme color. So in a lot of browsers, you're able to specify the theme color. And for the address bar here, you can see that the background is completely blue, and we're matching our UI and our application. So that and it also, the status bar, Android in particular, will take the theme color and then find the next darker color that actually matches it. And I'm not very good at color theory, so I'm glad Android does this for me. But it'll actually do that for you automatically, and that'll give you that kind of nice gradient into your application. Whoops, wrong button. All right, and then you specify a number of icons. And in this case, I'd say the minimum is you want a 192 by 192 icon and a 512 by 512 icon. And they're used in various places, including the splash screen, the add to home screen, and of course, when you have your icon added to the home screen of the application itself. So you can, at a minimum, you just want those 2 icon sizes, But if you have icon sizes that you've already submitted to the iOS store or the App Store on Google, you may want to add a bunch of different icons in there. And that really helps it because depending upon the device, it'll pick the proper resolution for you. You don't have to worry about it. All right, so let's talk a bit more about app shell architecture, which I alluded to earlier. And I've shamelessly stolen this slide from Google because I think it does a really good job of kind of showing it visually. So our application shell in this situation, and this is an app that was built with Polymer. You can really use any framework you want. But in this case, the app shell is that the title bar with the menu bar, and we have the slide out. So all of this stuff is your application shell. That's rarely going to change, and probably only going to change on version bumps. So what you want to be able to do is to specify those files as things you want to cache. And then the content itself is the thing that's going to change dynamically. And you're going to specify, you're going to specify that you can load that from the cache, but then again, when there's new stuff available from the network, you want to get it from the network. So it's just a way of kind of splitting your application into two pieces. And in order to build something like an application shell, you can use a number of these frameworks. All right, I do want to point out, though, if your favorite framework isn't there, it is this time because I hate you personally. OK, good. You're still paying attention. There were some smiles. No, again, it's because I'm too lazy to put like a million icons in there, except for jQuery. I hate jQuery. Don't use jQuery. I'm like, seriously. It served a purpose once. That purpose is kind of gone. It's only really syntactical sugar at this point in time. So again, we have Polymer, React, Vue, Preact, and Angular here. A lot of these frameworks will enable you to build an application shell. I do want to specify or specifically call out to two of them. One that I'm using a lot right now is Vue. That is really amazing. I've been super impressed by the ability to create Vue components and create applications by composing it of multiple components embedded in each other. And they're quite reusable amongst different applications. So if you haven't looked into Vue yet, you may want to take a look at it, see what you can borrow from it. And the one in the middle right there is Preact. So Preact is a React-like API, but it is only 3 kilobytes. So it is ridiculously small compared to React itself. If you want exactly a React API, then you can add Preact compat, and you have exactly the same thing, slightly bigger file size, but still way smaller than React. Sorry about that. So in order to do that, keeping your file sizes small, it's going to be a lot quicker for people to be able to download this stuff from the internet the first time and get to using your application faster. Preact does a fantastic job of that. But again, you can use any of these things. So let's talk about caching a bit, because that is one of the more important things about progressive web apps that we haven't really delved into yet. And caching is done via service workers. Really, what is a service worker? Well, it's basically a script that runs in the background of your browser. They're a little bit like web workers, but in this case, they have very specific functionality that they do. So one thing about service workers, you can only have one per website, basically. So you can't run 10 service workers on your website. So you don't have to worry about people misusing them and taking up all of your CPU or all of your cache on your desktop, because you just can't do that. The other nice thing about it is a service worker only runs in response to an event. So the event system is already built into your browser itself, but when your browser receives an event, it can check to see if there's a service worker that can handle it for that website, and then pass it on to the service worker in order to handle. So I just want to get across the point that service workers are not resource hogs on your browser. So this is just a really quick example of how do you add a service worker. So in your main JavaScript file, basically what you would be doing is to see if the service worker is supported in your browser. If it's not, you skip this step altogether and you just go across with all of your other things. I was trying to catch it when she was taking the picture, but it's all good. All right, so if it's not supported, then you just go about your business like normal, and you don't get this kind of progressively enhanced bit that you can have with service workers. But if it is, what you want to do is wait until you get the load event from your window, and once that's done, you just call the register command on your service worker. And basically, you're just passing it the path to your service worker file, which is just a JavaScript file that you can use to set all this stuff up. And what does it look like? Well, here's a couple of snippets from it. First off, you have your installation. So you may notice the very first 2 lines of this example, you have your cache version and your cache list. So you can really infer a couple of things from this immediately. One, you can have more than one cache because you have versions, and cache list gives you control over which files you want to cache into your application. And in this case, it's a very simple, contrived example, so we're really only doing our HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, our main files in the application. But what we're doing is we're waiting for the browser to pass us along at an install event, and then the service worker wakes up, and then it tells the browser that it wants to wait until it finishes everything in this block. So that's very important, because if the service worker is interrupted, all of the caching will fail, and we'll have to do this all over again. So in this case, all we're really doing is we're going to get those 3 files downloaded from the internet and save them into our cache. And then we have the activation stage. So that's the next part of the service worker lifecycle. In this case, we're not really doing anything fancy, but in like a real-life service worker, this would be a really good opportunity for you to go off and clean up older caches. So if you've released a new service worker with a v2 cache, and there's a file in v1 that you no longer need, this is the stage which you would actually clean it up. And here's kind of the big thing about service workers is they're very powerful in that they can intercept network requests. And in this case, anytime the browser wants to fetch something from the network, it'll send this fetch event to the service worker, and it will take a look at how it's supposed to respond. And in this case, again, we're just going back and we're saying, OK, we're going to take a look at all of our caches and see if we can match that request. So if that request to the internet is matched with something that we've already saved off into a local cache, we're going to return that to the user instead, thereby skipping a whole trip out to the internet and making it much faster for them to get this kind of data. If you don't have that match in the cache, then we're just going to do the normal internet request in order to get that data. So it's very simple. So a lot of this seems kind of contrived and boilerplate, doesn't it? It's because it is. So that's why Google wrote this really great utility called Workbox. And what Workbox allows you to do is to answer a few questions about how you want your service worker to behave, and then it will generate one for you. So you don't have to get into hand coding your service worker and possibly introducing bugs in it. Let Google introduce bugs in your own application for you. So when you want to embed Workbox into one of your web apps right now, you have a lot of different options. So if you're a Webpack expert, there's a plugin for Webpack for it. Again, if you're more on Gulp, there's a plugin for Gulp. And of course, if you just use plain old NPM scripts, you can do that too. So there's a lot of different caching strategies when it comes to service workers. You may want to cache everything locally and only go to the network when you can't find something in cache. Or you might always want to go to the network, and if that fails, go to the cache. There's all sorts of different combinations of you doing that. And if you actually answer the questions in Workbox correctly, it'll write that very convoluted code for you. So there's a pretty good book that's out just recently. It's called Building Progressive Web Apps. It's from O'Reilly. And there is a fantastic chapter on that about all of the different caching strategies you can use for service workers. And it explains it a lot better than I could in a 50-minute talk. So there's a link to that afterwards as well. Another tool that you can use with service workers is Lighthouse. So Lighthouse initially was an extension that you added to Google Chrome, and I think as of Chrome 62, it's included by default. And what it allows you to do is by clicking on the extension, it's going to run a set of tests against your website, and it's going to tell you whether or not it's going to perform very well and how it stacks up against the Progressive Web Apps best policies. So in this case, when I initially ran it against a little website that I was creating, didn't do a very good job there, did I? And then what happens is Lighthouse will give you a report of a number of things that you can fix. And amazingly enough, a lot of the things that give you a lot of benefit are not very difficult to fix. So if you just follow some of Lighthouse recommendations, like I did here, you get a lot better indication of how well your progressive web app is going to perform in the real world. Another pro tip for anybody that is using Lighthouse, you might want to do it in incognito mode or disable all of your other extensions, because lots of extensions in Chrome may kind of mess around with your incoming requests and kind of give you some false negatives on how well your application is actually performing. So that's a really good way of testing your progressive web apps. But I guess at this point in time, we need to start addressing the elephant in the room. Because really, the title of my talk was cross-platform progressive web apps, but I basically have been talking about kind of Google functionality. But the nice thing about it is, anytime I say Google, you can pretty much put Mozilla and Firefox in there as well, because they have very good support for progressive web apps. One of the only things that they don't have that they're currently working on it is the background sync functionality in service workers, but that's coming soon. So anyway, back to the elephant in the room, Apple. So how does Apple do with progressive web apps? Answer right now is not great. They don't support a lot of the functionality that is in progressive web apps. Apple was actually one of the originators in this space. They had the first OS to have add to home screen. So you're able to take a website and pin it to your device. So they kind of implemented their own spec long before a lot of the other vendors got together and decided upon how things should be done. So how do we actually take a progressive web app and get it to work properly if we're running it on iOS? Well, one of the first things that you can do is instead of in addition to having this manifest already filled out, what you can do is add a number of tags to your index.html or whatever your main page is in order to specify these values from the manifest. And in this case, if we want the short name to show up for the time that we do add to home screen on iOS, you add this meta tag, which is the web app's title. In this case, I call it progressive web app. If you don't add this, it's going to look at the title of your index.html. So that's good, but you don't have as much control in this case, because if your index.html title is longer than, I think it's 12 characters, it's going to look kind of weird. And if you have no title tag whatsoever, what Apple is going to put on the home screen is this thing called favorites. So you're going to have an icon with favorites underneath it, and your users are probably going to be like, what the heck is that? So this is a good tag to add in there. When it comes to the display side of things, where we want to have either a full screen or a standalone or a minimal UI, Apple supports that through this one meta tag called web app capable. And it doesn't give you a number of different values. It really gives you two things, yes or no. If you say no, then when you click on it from the home screen, it's going to load it up in Safari, and it's going to look exactly like a web page. If you say yes, well then the address bar and all of the buttons are going to be removed from it, and it'll look more like an application itself. Now, something very important for those of you who don't do a lot of iOS development. And I'm sure this is a Google conference, so most people have Android devices. Nice thing about an Android device, it's got a software back button. It's always there, so anytime you need to go back, you can do that. It doesn't exist on iOS. You only got that one home button. So if you don't structure your UI in such a way to give people a way to go back in your application, they'll get 2 or 3 layers deep and go, how the heck do I get out of this? And you're kind of stuck at that point in time. So when you're building your UI, make sure you give your users a way to go back. And then we take a look at the theme color. Again, Apple does not have as many options for this. Basically, you have the web app status bar style, and it has 3 possible values: black, black translucent, or translucent. So basically an all black status bar, a kind of dark translucent status bar, or a completely translucent status bar. So you can do some things with it, but not as much as you could on Chrome and Firefox. And then this is the real fun part. So when you do add to home screen, if you want there to be an icon specified for it, you want to include a link to an image. And this allows you to control what image shows up on add to home screen. Because can anybody guess what the icon looks like if you do add to home screen and you don't specify this tag? That's cool. I'll let you off the hook. Don't worry about it. So what it actually does is it takes a screenshot of the web app, and then it shrinks it down and shows this little tiny thing. And it's like, well, that's not very useful at all, because somebody's like flipping through their apps and they're like, what's this weird icon? And it's kind of, yeah. So definitely, if you're going to do progressive web app type stuff on iOS, include this link to a half-decent icon for your users to be able to tell what your application is. And it's the same thing with the splash screen. If you want to have a better user experience, you want to have a link to a splash screen as well. And when it comes down to it, the startup image, you can specify a number of different splash screens for different resolutions on iOS. So when it comes down to it, you do all these little tweaks in your index.html, and then all of a sudden, on Apple, your progressive web app is working kind of good. That's pretty good. It's not too bad. So we're good here, right? We don't have to worry about Apple anymore. Yeah. There's this thing. It's called iOS 11. I don't know if you've ever heard of it. Let's see. What did iOS 11 do? Oh, it broke the file input tag on apps that are added to home screen. So if you're using that in order to get access to files, it doesn't work anymore. It broke the camera integration on apps that are added to home screen. So if your progressive web app was there to select a picture or take a picture from the camera, that's broken on iOS 11. That's great, isn't it? And iOS 11 also introduces support for get user media, but it's only available in Safari. It's not available if you're building an app using UI WebView or WebKit WebView, or if you do add to home screen. All of a sudden, all that functionality just mysteriously disappears. It's gone, which is great. So what are your options at this point in time? It's like, well, you can cross your fingers and hope that Apple fixes it in a point release before we get to iOS 12. I don't know if that's going to happen. So the only really workaround you have right now is to remove that web app capable thing. So when you take that out of your index.html, when somebody does an add to home screen, when they start your app from the desktop, you're going to get the Safari's address bar and all the buttons and stuff like that. So that's unfortunate because it doesn't allow you to take full advantage of the screen real estate, but it does work around these bugs. You'll be able to take pictures again. You'll be able to get user media, lots of other advanced functionality that you couldn't otherwise do. So cautiously optimistic that it will be fixed in a point release, but I can't guarantee that it will be. Anybody who tracks web standards may have been involved in the IndexedDB kind of debacle that Apple has been going on with. They take 2 steps forward and 1 step back every time with IndexedDB. It kind of breaks some things and fixes some things, but hopefully this won't be like that. A lot of signals point to things looking much better once iOS 12 hits. So what about service workers? Are service workers even workable on iOS? So a few months ago, the answer to this question was maybe sometime. The only signal we had from Apple is that it is part of our 5-year plan, and we were already 2 years into that 5-year plan, and there was no movement on service workers at that point in time. But just recently, that's gone green because Apple has officially come out and said service workers are under development right now. So again, I don't expect to see this in an iOS point release. I do expect to see it probably in iOS 12 next year. So if you're kind of waiting in order to get on the progressive web app kind of bandwagon and you're just waiting for Apple to do it, this gives you kind of an idea of how long it's going to be until you've got progressive web apps supported across Android, iOS, and Microsoft Windows. So you should start looking into it now so that you're a little bit ahead of the game. And as well, the web app manifest. So they recently, as of October 24th, said that they're working on support for manifest.json. So a lot of those tweaks that we just showed you to add to your HTML page, you won't need to do those tweaks in probably, again, iOS 12. So support for progressive web apps is coming in iOS. So I'm very excited about that. But until that point in time, what do you do if you want to build a web application that runs pretty well on Android and iOS? Well, you can kind of do the things that I said and add those tweaks in there. Or there's another open source project that I work on. It's called Apache Cordova, and some folks may also know it as Adobe's PhoneGap. Basically, those are exactly the same thing. Cordova is the open source version. PhoneGap is a distribution that Adobe puts out. But trust me, I commit to Cordova every day. It's exactly the same thing. So what that allows you to do is to take your HTML, JavaScript, and CSS assets, wrap it up in a web view, and deploy it to an app store, whether it be the Play Store on Google or the App Store on iOS. So in order to give you full kind of progressive web app functionality, one of the things that I'm working on is going through the list of all of the APIs that Cordova supports. A lot of them supported the older version of the W3C manifests, or sorry, W3C APIs. And by the end of the year, I'm going to have all of those APIs up to date with current functionality. We just recently did media recorder and image capture that are up to the current spec that's used in Chrome. So you can kind of track that in this PhoneGap plugin PWA. But as well, if you want to add service workers to your iOS application, you can use the service worker plugin. Now, it's not as critical because on iOS, when you're packaging everything into an app, those assets are cached in the IPA. They're on your device already. But where it does come in handy is if you go off to the network and you get this network request and you want to cache it automatically. So that's what the service worker plugin will allow you to do. But another piece of good news, Alistair, who works at the Guardian in New York City, he's currently working on kind of a wrapper around WebKit WebView, which he calls Service Worker WebView, which adds native service worker support to the WebView. And we're really looking into that as a way of providing service worker functionality without having to add the plugin in there. So we're hoping for that in the not too distant future. And really what you would want to use that for is, we're assuming that iOS 12 will support service workers, but if you still need to use the same code base on an earlier version of iOS, you would use either the service worker WebView or the service worker plugin. In order to kind of like do something like this, you would install Cordova from NPM. Then you would create a new application, and you just point it at your web assets, all of your HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. And from that point, you can add the service worker plugin in there, tweak a couple of configuration parameters, and then you just run your app, and it will be able to be deployed to the App Store on iOS. So that's great. Your boss is super happy with you. He says, you're awesome. Congratulations. You've got a single code base that runs in a whole lot of different places. That's awesome. And we're like well set up for when iOS 12 hits, and we can do all of this without actually requiring Cordova. So the really weird thing is I've been working in Cordova and PhoneGap since 2010, 2011. And the whole point of the project was to go away at a certain point in time. It's just taken us a really lot longer than we thought it would. But we do see a lot of adoption of progressive web apps, especially on Android and with Firefox and with Chrome. And we're really excited about some of the news coming out of iOS. So we're actually thinking that maybe by the end of next year, we might not have to maintain this open source project any longer. So that's pretty much all I've got to talk about here today. But I am around for questions, and I'll answer them off here. And again, when the slides get presented or posted out to everyone, there's like a bunch of links here that I talked about that you can like kind of dive into for more information. All right, so.
Do we have some live questions? Anyone? So we can switch to slide.
All right, no live questions. We will go. All right, so the first question is, do you recommend building Android apps with React Native? Ugh, I hate to be a jerk, but I'm going to say maybe. So you have to choose the right tool for the right job. And I never try to tell people, like, you have to do it this way, and this is the only way you have to do it. But if your development shop is an Android development shop, I don't think you want to go React Native because you're just putting another layer on top of things. If you're very comfortable with working in JavaScript and your application needs to be deployed to both Android and iOS, then I would look at React Native as a possible solution for that. Now, it's not a be-all, end-all because there are some packages that you can put on top of React Native that get you closer to full code reuse, but they're not all the way there yet. So yeah, you can look at doing something like that. If you're looking at another cross-platform way of doing things, there's a company called Progress, and they have a product called NativeScript, which basically does the same thing as React Native. It allows you to use JavaScript, use a JavaScript API to get access to like native UI components. The nice thing about NativeScript over React is that with NativeScript, you have somebody to blame when something goes wrong. You can actually like pay them money for support, and sometimes managers really like that, to be able to point fingers at someone. With React and React Native, it's an open source project from Facebook, so you don't have that same type of thing. And if you're a predominantly web shop, then I would look more towards the Cordova, PhoneGap, Ionic way of doing things, where you're just writing a web application and wrapping it with a web view in order to be deployed. So I hope that answers your question. Do you think that PWAs will stick around for? Yeah, no. I do think progressive web apps will stick around for quite some time. Like I said, I've been working in PhoneGap, Cordova land for about 7 years, and progressive web apps is kind of the natural progression of where that was going, with all of these APIs being supported in the browser, with you being able to install the applications directly from the browser. There's a lot of signals from Google and from Microsoft that these are going to become first-class citizens. In fact, Microsoft with Windows 10 is going to be searching the internet, finding good progressive web apps and including them directly into their Windows application store. So I think they're going to be around for quite some time. All right. Is it true that all people in Canada apologize for everything? Yes. Yes, it is. I bump into people all the time, and even if they like just flatten me, I'm like, oh, I'm so sorry. So there's, let's see if I get the accent right, because it's not my version of Canada. Oh, geez, I'm so sorry, eh? Was that Canadian enough for you? But yeah. Why do I hate jQuery? OK. All right, I hate jQuery because people, when we started doing a lot of this web stuff about 7 years ago, people were using jQuery and jQuery mobile to build really bad applications. They weren't very performant at all, and that is where my hatred of it has come up from. Now, jQuery was a wonderful tool for building cross-platform sites that work on like IE6 and on Firefox and on Chrome and in Safari. That was fantastic. But when you try to take jQuery, and jQuery was pretty big, and jam it into a mobile browser, that's where everything went to hell in a handbasket. And again, that's where my hatred comes from. All right. Is PWA really viable with all those issues on iOS? It's like, well, yeah. It's getting there. So right now, I would suggest if you really want to write a progressive web app on iOS, that you look at what you can't do with it and kind of make that decision whether or not you're going to need to wrap it in Cordova or not. If you take the web app capable and you set it to no, it's going to start up in Safari, but you're going to have access to a lot of the browser's APIs. So you can get a lot of the way there. But really, you got to take a look at the checklist for what functionality you need in your application and decide from there. Do you recommend the Ionic framework with Cordova for cross-platform mobile app development? Yeah, I do. Good friends with a lot of people on the Ionic team. They do some fantastic stuff over there. The real nice thing about the Ionic framework is it provides you a lot of that UI stuff in HTML that you don't have to write. The only problem that I had with Ionic is that it was specifically using Angular. So if you didn't know Angular or your whole application was written in a different framework, it was a little more difficult to add Ionic into your application. Now, something really exciting coming up from Ionic just a couple of months ago is this thing they called Stencil.js. And basically, it allows you to write web components. And so all of Ionic is being converted over to web components, which means it's going to be so much easier to embed Ionic components into Vue applications, into React applications, into Angular applications, into Polymer applications. So you'll get all of the benefit of Ionic's UI without having to be specifically tied to Angular. So yeah, Ionic, fantastic choice. What is the biggest fail in your career? Not spilling this water all over things here. Wow, really? That's the biggest fail in my career. You know what? Hit me up after a couple of beers, and I'll probably have a better answer. So, do you have any guilty pleasures in technology? Guilty pleasures like using Vista or coding in PHP? Okay, I hate coding in PHP. I taught at a local university for 8 months, and they taught most of their courses using PHP. And I was trying to show them the various job trends, and like PHP was heading this way, and like Node was heading this way, and they wouldn't even teach a course on it. But using Microsoft technologies at this point is no longer a guilty pleasure. This is my Mac that I have through work, but I've also bought a Surface for myself just to play around with it. I got the cheapest Surface laptop that I could possibly get, but it's actually really good hardware. Microsoft Windows 10 is a lot better than Windows 7, for instance. And they're doing some fantastic stuff in the open source community and with a lot of their APIs. So Microsoft is no longer the evil corporation that they used to be. Satya Nadella is pretty amazing. So I mean, it's kind of funny. It's like Bill Gates, pretty amazing company. Steve Ballmer heading to the toilet. Satya Nadella heading to the rocket ship to the stars. So I think we can pretty much figure out why that is. All right. What do you like or dislike more, Android or iOS? I'm more of an Android person. I've done a lot more development on Android than I have on iOS. But because my job is basically a jack of all trades, master of none, I don't know if that same expression exists in the Czech Republic. Anyway, I have to learn a lot of different languages, a lot of different technologies. So I kind of flip back and forth between programming in Java on Android, Objective-C or Swift on iOS, and then doing JavaScript programming on the web. So right now, I'd say I still prefer doing Android and Java development, but it's because I'm super old and I started learning Java in 1995. So there's that. Is it possible an app for iOS with PhoneGap without a certificate? Short answer, no. If you want to deploy to the App Store, no matter what, you have to pay the Apple tax, get that certificate so you can deploy to the App Store on iOS. However, if you are building an application, you just want to kind of try out things, there are a number of viewer applications. For instance, there's the PhoneGap developer app, which allows you to kind of build everything on your local desktop and then do a PhoneGap serve, which allows you to go into your phone and load up that content from your desktop into the PhoneGap developer app. So it allows you to do a lot of the preview. Ionic has also recently released their developer app, so it kind of gives you the same functionality that PhoneGap serve does. So that way it allows you to test how well you actually like those kind of frameworks and technologies without paying the Apple tax. But when you actually go to deploy to the App Store, you need to pay the Apple tax. Any preferred dev environment? Code, Atom, IntelliJ. So, geez, like, you know, nobody, okay, so yeah, somebody in here is a VI developer who wants to tell everybody about it. I know that for a fact, because they always do. I was a big fan of Atom for a really long time. I had a pretty good workflow going in it, but over time, it started taking up more and more resources, and it was really just killing my computer. I know quite a few people on the Dev Evangelist team at Microsoft, and they were always forcing me to use VS Code, which I started doing a couple of months ago, and I will never look back now because it's pretty amazing. So if you're a current Atom user, I would say give VS Code a try for about a week. You'll be pretty impressed by it. A lot of the extensions into it are pretty amazing. Yeah, that's about it. So that's all the questions. If there are any more live questions, just come talk to me. I'll be around for the rest of the night.